Welcome back to FM91. This is Fatemah Sultan, your host on the Green Hour. Today is our 50th episode. I have not been here for all 50 episodes, but I have been here for a bit and I was a guest before, so I feel very happy to be part of this journey as we make it to the 50 mark. But today we have Namra Khalid from Karachi Cartography with us today. I am so excited to talk to you, and now my excitement is coming out because I have been following your work for a really long time now, and I know you also work with some of my friends and have in the past, so I am just in awe of your work. So let me introduce you a little bit more before we get into a conversation. Namra Khalid is an architectural designer turned urban researcher and a positive change maker, and her work strives to create climatic justice in the most vulnerable communities in Pakistan. Good morning, Namra. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I know I've been trying to get you in, and I'm just very happy to have you here today. How are you doing?
Hi, Fatemah. Thank you so much for having me here, and thank you for such a nice introduction. Sorry.
Yeah, but tell me, how are you doing? Maybe you can give a little bit of an introduction to your work and then we can get into it.
So my work is called Karachi Cartography. We're a small non-profit.
Yeah.
We're currently having an internship right now, which has a couple of people doing some amazing work. But yes, our work involves creating socio-climatic justice, mostly in Karachi at the moment, and we do this through maps, which is a little different than what you see in general.
Yeah. So that's also coming into more about Karachi Cartography, which is something how I just said before we started filming, which is so it's in line with heritage, which I think is something as someone who's obsessed with history and culture. I know heritage is a big part of maps, and maps is remapping environments and areas is a big part of heritage restoration, because heritage restoration does not have to do with physical landmarks or communities. It has a lot to do with our knowledge of the past. And can you tell me a little bit more about how your work is in line with restoring these communities, specifically since you are focused in Karachi, and that's such a rich cultural environment, and I know there's so much to be learned and so much that we can't forget.
Definitely. So heritage in this context again would mean more of the climatic heritage, more of the heritage of the natural physiography of Karachi, and that's how that's where maps also come in. At the moment, we don't necessarily know what the initial conditions of the city were before we saw this mass urbanization. We saw such a influx of population, which was 1947 the migration. Even before that, during the British times,
as a fishing village.
We were actually it's a fairly new city. Before 200 years, we were
it's nothing. It was nothing. That's why it's so interesting to see how we've become one of the most populated cities in the world, because it's a lot of the other cities are much older than Karachi is. If you compare Cairo and Karachi's population is right next to each other, but Karachi is fairly new. And
Karachi is fairly new. And till 1838, our population was 14 million.
Yeah.
And now there's such a huge debate on what the actual population is, but some figures even show 30 million.
Yeah.
So that's
that's easily the largest city in the world.
Yeah, and also such a huge difference in 200 years, such a fast change. And obviously to accommodate that change, there was a lot of construction, there was a lot of changes in what was there. So our work basically talks about what the original conditions were and what changed. Obviously, a certain amount of change cannot be restored, and we wouldn't even want it to be restored to that. And they're settlements there. There's no point of removing that. But at the same time, we are living in a climate crisis. Karachi, while we can say that the global north is the biggest contributor, we have definitely done things to exacerbate the situation.
100%. That's exactly the conversation I've also been having in these spaces, that yes, it's not just about who emits the most carbon, it's about how do you actually look after the communities in these spaces, especially as an urban community, which is something that I'm always talking about, always focusing on, because that's something that's not taken into consideration when talking about the climate crisis.
Exactly. So then the whole conversation comes that how do we at least try to bring whatever best practices and whatever systems we can safe and maybe even bring back to the thing. And that's where we need maps.
Yeah.
Because right now the situation is that a lot of our maps are still disputed colonial property.
Yes.
Some are. It's a very funny story actually. When we actually had our partition, the National Archives were in India. So India and Pakistan and the whole situation there. So the maps of Karachi were also a lot of them were in India. So India, not just Karachi, a lot of other cities in Pakistan as well. So India said that it's their property because it's in
their National Archives.
In National Archives. Pakistan said that it's ours because the location being shown is ours. And as it turns out with every other fight, it became disputed, and now most of them are in the Library of Congress in London.
As they just went back to the British.
Yeah.
We couldn't make up our minds. And I think that's also a really big, like, a point that I'd always would like to connect is, like, maps are so important in Pakistani and South Asian history. Like, if we go back to 1947 and just talking about, like, our own mapping and, like, how it was just done so badly and it was done so irresponsibly without consideration of the communities that live there. That's so important when also talking about, like, the communities that live in Karachi and all around the Indus Delta, that these communities have to be taken into consideration. And if, like, government leaders and, like, leaders of today don't take that into consideration, they're technically doing the same thing that happened to us in 1947.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then even before that, if you think of the time before that, Karachi was permanently going from one hand to another, the Talpurs, the whole thing.
Yeah.
And that's why a lot of maps during that time also got lost. We're not even sure if they were made and documented that properly. Another thing with our situation is that maps are often thought of as like art pieces rather than being used for information as spatial data. So a lot of them even ended in people's private archives.
Yeah, so you don't know where they are.
We don't. It's like, how am I supposed to know what's in someone's drawing room?
Yeah.
Yeah. Or maybe not even in the drawing room, somewhere
because that's
in the storage.
actually what happened to so many, like, South Asian, like, historical pieces and, like, so much of, like, documentation which was so rich here that it just got, like, split up in, like, private auctions and so on, and there's no, like, tracing back of it.
Exactly. So that's why we started with an open call that if you have a map wherever you are, just send it in.
That's such an amazing idea. Can you tell me a little bit more about, like, the type of maps you got?
We actually ended up getting over 200 maps, and so many people sent whatever they had in their literally private collections passed from grandfather to, and that sort of stories. We also found out that our maps are in museums and archives all across the world, and by all across the world I literally mean from America to Czechoslovakia and Japan as well.
That's extremely random. Like, I don't know what a Karachi map is doing there. But even when I was, like, looking at all of these different, like, archives, because I have worked in different parts of, like, heritage restoration, it's like everything is so split up all over the world that even if you want to, like, bring it back today and, like, actually track in with urban, like, communities and indigenous communities and understand how far they're traced back to, all of the documentation isn't in, like, civil access in Pakistan. And I feel like I feel like Karachi cartography is a very unique project because it, like, shows, like, the importance of civil access into these spaces. And also, like, I don't think a lot of Pakistanis know about even our national archives and our mappings, and be it in Karachi, be it in Pakistan, be it different communities, but it is very important to focus on.
Definitely. And a lot of things we also have are not digitally available.
Yeah.
So that again becomes a problem because how do you get access to it if you're in a different location, and how do you navigate through the situation? So we are trying our best to make everything open access.
So as, like, you said before also, like, Karachi cartography is currently in stage 1 of cartographic analysis, if I'm right. But can you tell me a little bit more about that and, like, how this, like, stage building will, like, lead you into different phases, or, like, what your hopes are through Karachi cartography?
So before we start that, I have one thing to say. We actually have not proposed too many solutions right now. We're coming to them, but we haven't. And we take a lot of pride in the fact that we're not proposing solutions.
That's a good thing also.
Yeah, I think so too. One of the things that you often see in Karachi after the urban flooding every year is that you see these mass projects of stormwater drains, you see these mass projects of different things. and I don't remember a single time any of them have been successful.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Yes. So what we're trying to do is work on the problem identification before going in this ad hoc manner of proposing solutions.
Because it's very rushed. It happens so fast. It has no actual implementation for like long-term like planning, and it's just like short-term solutions that aren't even actually short-term solutions, and then you just forget about it till the next problem arises. So problem identification in communities like Karachi it's the problem. It's like what we need before we can do anything.
Yeah. And that's exactly where the cartographic analysis comes in. So cartography, in the general most terms, is the act of mapping or understanding maps and everything revolving that. Again, like after like gathering all these maps, what we're trying to do is create a timeline of them and to observe how layering them over each other and observe how things have changed, observe how when there were certain aspects when we were better, what were the conditions that were helping us out, and also comparing them with other cities which are still being able to manage through the climate crisis. Using these, we can also figure out what areas are the ones which have more heat islands and what are the conditions that are causing them. We can also figure out what our natural physiography was like and where it has been completely disrupted. Drainage channels, hydrological systems and everything.
So I think that's such a great like thing. Is there something that you'd want like listeners or the audience listening in to get involved with when it comes to Karachi cartography? Because there's so many aspects that affects every single like civil society, every aspect of civil society, and so many civilians, be it young, old, researchers, engineers, scientists. Like I say, there's so many spaces to get involved, and I think that's also what I'm trying to do like on this show, just to show so many different dynamics of people working in the climate space, because there is no one expectation.
Definitely. I think we're always looking for supporters, volunteers, and anyone who even has maps to contribute to our work.
I feel like this is such a great call out for like maps. Like if you have a map at home, if you don't even know what it is, just share it with Karachi Cartography and they will 100% just see where it can help. This is something that I also just want to understand a lot, is like, because like how you said, a lot of the maps are like from the past, and like they help you connect in timelines and spaces that have been left out in like our archives, be it like an urban map. So how would you say like your mapping is different from the way people perceive it? Because a lot of times, like you said, maps are art pieces and people don't see them for what they actually were used for anymore, because people just see Google Maps and they think that's what a map is. But maybe you can tell us a little bit more about how like maps help communities come up with solutions, or like mapping out, like how you said ecology, like mapping out ecology and different biodiversity in different areas and indigenous communities as well. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, actually, we were just having a conversation right before I came here about how the backwaters were literally part of the sea before. The entire boat basin area was actually part of the sea, and how there was a mass disruption of mangroves for that, and now it has become a little lake. So if you think about it from a fish's point of view, you can think of it as actually going back a little bit. So if you think about maps and you even look at just satellite data, so satellite maps for Karachi started being taken around the 1970s. So before that, we just have other maps. And then if you like look at the evolutions of satellites, you will see that this backwater area was actually part of the sea, and then it got cut off. And now if you think of it from a fish's point of view, you would not think that, okay, if they were left on the other side and became part of the lake, suddenly they're disconnected from everything else. We've also had architects who literally proposed that we should have a bridge for the fish now, which is going to be a one-of-a-kind thing, but then it'll reconnect the systems back together.
That's also something that's really interesting, because like that's something that I used to hear from my grandparents a lot, especially like how they've like grown up in Karachi and they've seen like literally the sea be pushed back because like even the house that my grandparents live in, like it's 55 years old, so they saw the entire like development of like Defense and Clifton and it being made, and even like how like Clifton was literally part of the seabed and how it's like been pushed back so much, especially in the last like 10 years. Like I've physically like watched it be pushed back. And I think that's also something I was reading about like on the Karachi cartography page, like how there is a statistic that Karachi is a city that can be underwater, and why it's very important that when you push these backwaters out, like how it's going to come in and affect us differently.
Yeah, definitely. I think Karachi could definitely be submerged in water, and we do see that happening
in the delta already.
Yeah, we do see that happening in the delta, and even if we not think of this from like a point of view of sea level rise, we see urban flooding almost every year.
Yeah.
Like last year we were under, like our roads were underwater for almost 2 months.
Yeah, because that essentially was the ocean bed, and that's why it floods in such a specific way. It's not even just bad mismanagement. It's like those areas were literally the ocean floor, and now they will flood in a very different manner, and that's why the solutions also have to be different. And like you said, there is a lot of mismanagement. So even when these areas were built, it wasn't taken into consideration that these areas can flood, because they very much are not like stable land, and they were never built for the purposes, or they were never for the purposes that we use them for.
Exactly. And then on top of it, we've built upon all stormwater drains, blocking the entire pathway. And then the question again comes that water will go somewhere or the other.
Yeah.
If you don't make a pathway for it,
it will find its way.
It will find its own way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's also something like I'll also connect it, like how I was telling you before, like even like how different departments and leaders and politicians, like they don't take this into consideration. It's like the same problem like how I was telling you, like how communities settled into Jacobabad permanently, but because the British made like water channels there, so people settled where water was, but essentially those areas were never habitable, and they only became habitable the last 200 years. And indigenous communities in Sindh and Balochistan were constantly like moving because they knew the areas that were too hot, and now we have some of the largest settlements in the hottest place on earth. And that's so much of why like mapping is important, because if we knew that those were the hottest areas on earth from like indigenous knowledge, we wouldn't have been making those mistakes with settlements there. And I feel like that's so much like connected into your work and into like what your work is trying to do with mapping, and why we cannot like keep repeating the same mistakes after again and again and again. So yeah, like maybe you can tell us a little bit more about like a specific project that you're working on, and then we can talk a little bit more about like your Young Climate Visionary Prize, which I was very like in awestruck of. And I know you've done a lot of work with like grant research in like different areas, so I would love to know a little bit more about that, because I'm sure being a Pakistani in an international space is incredibly overwhelming.
Yeah, I think so. Also with the heat thing that you were talking about, another thing is that this was the hottest July in the history of
the
world, recorded history at least, and most likely like even more. Like it was what 125,000.
It broke 4 records in every day. Became the hottest day every day. Like it just kept breaking the record every day, and I think it's insane. Like the headlines the last few weeks have been insane. They're nothing new for us, but it's just interesting to see like international reactions.
But while that is true, the scientific community is also saying that for our future self, this will be the coldest July.
Yeah,
so
I saw
crazy.
that. I just swiped. I was like, I don't even want to know. The coldest July, and it's the hottest I've ever felt.
Yeah, and then we're talking about these things. I keep hitting this.
That's completely okay.
And we're talking about these things, and then we're also talking about, obviously we face so many heat waves, and there are ways that we can actually, like urban heat islands, we can create urban cooling islands in Karachi, but we're doing the exact opposite. And maps also tell us how to do that. So I just had to emphasize that point.
Of course, I think I even said this 2 shows ago, that this is the coolest summer of our life, and I feel like that is something that should scare people, because it scares me. I hate the heat. I hate it. And just watching like the way reactions have turned in like a global north context, like where air quality inequality was never a priority. Now it's a priority. Like someone said that, oh, we went from like a global pandemic of wearing masks and now we're back to wearing masks. And I'm like, that should be a major wake-up call for even Pakistanis. Like, I still have yet to see like the type of reactions that we should be having. Like, I don't think that's there right now. I feel like there's a lot of greenwashing and a lot of single narrative perspectives, and that we're not the problem, but like you are the problem if you're not managing the problem.
Exactly.
And that's very frustrating for me, and I'm sure like I'm still very much in awe with your work, because I think it's so unique, and it's so necessary. It's like unique in the way that we need it. So that's just something that I'd love to like know more about, like how you got involved with like the Young Climate Visionary Prize, and like how that experience was with you, because I know you're working with so many young people from all over the world, so sometimes it becomes overwhelming and you're just like, is my work even good enough to be here? I ask myself that all the time. So
exactly. I think so. How I got involved with the Young Climate Prize was honestly just a coincidence sort of situation. It used to keep coming as an ad on my Facebook all the time. So I just applied. I was like, okay, I'll do it. And then I think it was one of the most wonderful experiences because it was their first go. And they had arranged mentorship. They had
like I was looking through it and I thought it was amazing. Like I thought some of the projects that were coming up were just insanely unique and so necessary. And I just loved like the fact that you were presenting your work at the Guggenheim. I thought that was amazing. I love when people talk about Karachi in different spaces. It is my favorite thing to talk about. So like what was that experience like?
Incredible. Again, the mentorship. So my mentor, and who's also the advisor for Karachi cartography now, is Hank Owing. Hank Owing is the World Water Ambassador. He was the Sherpa to the UN for the water conference, and he's someone who genuinely cares.
That's nice.
And he understands the context of Pakistan.
Amazing. Love people like that.
But also while doing that has the theoretical knowledge as well as
he knows his facts.
He knows his fact. He was actually part of Obama's Hurricane Sandy. After that, the whole water design situation.
Okay.
So,
that's amazing.
That's amazing.
So what was it like presenting your work? Like what was like the setup? Like how do you feel like people like had a reaction to it? Like especially people from a non-global South context.
So we did present at the Guggenheim, which was again amazing because it's a prestigious place for
I love museums, so I'm a huge fan.
It was an interesting conversation. So many of them were like mind blown by the fact that so you know how New York and the Union Square has that time clock?
I literally just did a thing with them last week.
Oh, you did? That change of 5 years.
The climate clock,
and that's always talking about the future and how the climate crisis will be in the future. So for the global north, even at the time that I went there, they were always talking about climate crisis in terms of future.
I had the same experience 2 months ago, and it was just insane. Like I had the same, because everyone was talking about a few years later, and I was like, what about right now? Or like before? Like, what are you guys talking about?
For us, it's literally every day. Like
it's like
it's a flood, it's the heat wave, it's a cyclone threat.
I was at the pre-sessional agenda for COP in June, and the same time there was like evacuation notices in Sindh and Karachi, and I'm sitting there and I'm watching these people talk about like a future context, and then I'm like opening my phone and looking at like the dawn, and it's all about like evacuation notices, 100,000 people removed, my mother getting like if you want to evacuate you can notice, and she's like, I'm not going anywhere. And then like it's just the ground reality is so far away from what is being discussed in these international spaces, and I'm sure you felt that as well. Like when people talk in a future context, you're just like, what are you even talking about?
Exactly. And then I've loved everyone I've interacted with, and they've been super helpful, but there's also a lot of tone deafness.
Yes, there is.
There is, right?
Yes, there is.
When you talk about informal settlements, nobody has any idea what the closest thing they can relate to is.
And that's insane, because for us it's like informal settlements are such a big part of like our like cultural identity, especially like all over South Asia. It's so
It is.
engraved, and they don't even know what that is.
And then when we're talking about climate change, informal settlements are such a huge part of that, because these are going to be the most, and already are, the most vulnerable communities.
Yeah.
How we'll deal with them is so different than what we've been thinking of so far.
Yeah. I feel like if people think of like informal settlements, they'll think of like Slumdog Millionaire, or they'll think of specific like movies in Bollywood that just like convey different stories of someone getting out of like a poor background and just running through and making something of themselves. Like there's no actuality and understanding into that. Like informal settlements are just created in spaces where there's like access to water and basic food, and they are just built and built and built and built. And like you said, Karachi is so new. It is not an old city at all. It has barely been around. It was a fishing village, and then it turned into a ginormous city, and it's the perfect example of an informal settlement. And even to this day, like the way it's being planned, it's done so informally that you're just building. It hasn't stopped, and that's a big part.
There's no plan at all, actually.
There is no plan.
And through Arif Hassan's research and even our own mapping of Kachi Abadis, it seems like 62.2% of Karachi is informal settlements.
Exactly.
That's so... Yeah, we don't even take these things into account.
It's endless also. Like when you go, and like when I've done like research with different like Kachi Abadis, it's like when you go into these spaces, it's just endless and endless and endless, and people themselves don't know like what's where. Like they don't know, like, and that's why mapping is again so important, because we don't know where things are. And there was something else that I was just thinking of that was really related to this, but it's completely slipped my mind. So coming back to like different like international spaces, like the tone deafness of it is just a little insane. And I feel like that's why it's so important to like alleviate and like talk about like people in Karachi doing such amazing work and talking about it on like a national channel like this, because it's like it's so connected into our civil identity, and this is something that we should be giving more volume than like talking a lot about like failed governance. Because if civil society is going to start talking about the problems very specifically, even governance will have to see that this is something that needs to be addressed. And even like I have read a lot of environmental codes for Sindh. Like I have gone through them, and some of them are so great, but just the lack of implementation of like basic environmental codes is like insane to me, because I know it's so much of an untapped thing, and like it will continue to like help us. So is that something also that Karachi Cartography looks into?
Yeah, we definitely do think that we need to go at a policy level, and implementation is so important. Otherwise it's just going to be talks. You know.
But I think with your problem identification, that's like amazing. Like that is exactly where it needs to be, because otherwise these policies have no place if they don't even know what they're addressing.
Exactly. And then I think the community does need to stand up for themselves. That in the that also in the international sphere, because again, applying for these grants, applying for these awards or projects becomes really important. Pakistan right now ranks 8th on the climate risk index by the German Watch. Our floods were the biggest water-related, also the biggest natural disaster of the 21st century in terms of
1/3 of the country.
And yet we are not at the center of the climate conversations.
Not at all. I have seen this firsthand. I have sat in the room. Not at all. Not at all. Nothing.
And if nobody else is talking about it, we need to take our steps forward and start doing that.
If no one else is doing it, it is a good enough reason for us to do it. 100%.
And most of us have really good projects, and we should not feel so bad.
Like I always like tell like my friends in different aspects who are all doing such amazing work in their specific fields, I'm like, you know that I'm not like an environmental like scientist student. Like I'm doing what I have with my resources, and I feel like that's something I'd really want like listeners to know, that like you do not need to be fitting into a bracket of an expectation of an environmentalist. It's like what you do with what you have and how you like help, like be it urban research, be it science, be it engineering, be it a doctor, be it there's so many things. Like even the medical industry is so important here, because it's a part of like risk management, and like post post floods, like health is such a big aspect of it. So yeah, that's something I try to talk about a lot, and I try to like constantly reiterate on the show as well. And coming to our closing question, this is something that I always try to ask everyone. It's like, what is a common misconception like in your field that you feel is like misunderstood when you're trying to show how mapping is related to the climate crisis?
I think firstly, people don't think that they're related at all, especially someone who's coming from the Western lens.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is because their things have already been documented to a very large extent, and they already have maps for it.
Yeah.
So when you already have maps and already have the background research to begin with, you start taking it for granted. Like right now we have electricity, so we're not thinking about load shedding. But if they're gone, then we'll have to start from scratch.
Yeah.
Like, and that's the same situation with maps. That we need to, it might not be related in the obvious context, but it forms the basis of research.
Yeah.
So that's why we do need to start with that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on today. I really, really appreciate it. I absolutely love the work you do, and I'm a huge fan of your work, and I can't see like how far you go, because I know this is going to go very, very far. And I don't doubt that for a second. If there's anything you'd like to say to our listeners before we close out, I'd love to know what your final words are.
I would just say that we need to step up.
Yeah.
I think we need to rise up as a community and try our level best. It is true that the climate crisis is making us so vulnerable to health risks and depression and everything, that it also makes us like, it also stops us from actually like thinking
wanting
about
to do anything.
Yeah. But at the same time, if we don't rise up for ourselves, nobody else is going to. So let's do whatever we can.
Yeah, I always try to leave with a little bit of hope, because I feel like these headlines can be very depressing, and they are very much like, we can't help this ginormous problem. But no, this was a man-made natural disaster, and it will also be fixed by man.
I hope so.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
Yeah. And thank you so much for coming on today. I really, really appreciate it. And thank you for being the 50th guest of The Green Hour. And tune in next week, as we will be talking more about different aspects of the climate crisis and debunking them at The Green Hour with Fatemah Sultan every Friday, 10 to 11 a.m. Thank you.
Thank you.